in Iran would essentially be packaged as an extension of the war in Iraq. How do you win the war in Iraq? You bomb Iran. Kind of like, how do you win the war in Vietnam? Well, you bomb Cambodia. But there is something very interesting in the rhetoric that is coming out of the administration that I think bears notice. If you recognize the way that the president has been talking about the threat from Iran for many, many, many months, it was, we cannot allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. We cannot allow them to develop nuclear weapons. We cannot allow them to develop nuclear weapons. And then as it became very clear, long before the NIE became public, of course, that Iran very likely is not developing nuclear weapons, the rhetoric changed. And now what you hear the president saying all the time is, we cannot allow Iran to have the knowledge to create nuclear weapons. The knowledge. Just knowing how to do it is enough. Which I actually find kind of interesting, because I'm pretty sure that, I don't know, there are probably some physics students in this room that know how to develop a nuclear weapon, right? I mean, it's knowledge that I'm pretty sure you can get off the internet. But secondly, we also know that Iran and Iran's physicists already know how to develop nuclear weapons. And so, short of prying their heads open and sucking the knowledge out of their brains, the idea of forbidding someone to have a certain knowledge is absurd. But I think it is also indicative of where this U.S.-Iran relationship, it's indicative to an understanding of the complexity of this U.S.-Iran relationship, which, as Stephen says, goes far beyond any kind of political considerations, but is a much more visceral, much more deep-seated emotional relationship. And I think that's the case on both sides. When you talk to Iranian political analysts and members of the Iranian government, when they talk about what they want from the United States, usually, within the litany of complaints that they have, fairly legitimate complaints, really, what you hear over and over again is this idea that we want respect from America. We are a major power in this region, politically, even economically, although Iran's, economy is in shambles, and if oil weren't $100 a barrel, it would have been in total collapse by now. But nevertheless, Iran really recognizes itself as culturally, historically, politically, and militarily a major power in that region. And although the rest of Europe, and indeed most of the Middle East, does recognize Iran as that power, and does not just treat Iran with that kind of respect, but in their relations with Iran, it's always indicative that this is a power that has to be dealt with. That has not really happened with regard to the relationship between America and Iran. And so, for instance, a wonderful example of this occurred during the last presidential elections in Iran, the elections that brought us Ahmadinejad. If you recall, now I should emphasize that there's a lot wrong with Iran's political culture. But like it or not, Iran in the last 30 years has had 14 of the freest and fairest elections in the whole of the Middle East outside of Israel. But during the last presidential elections, we were sort of treated to the sight of Condoleezza Rice in Cairo, standing next to Hosni Mubarak, praising Egypt for the steps that it was taking towards democracy, and pointing the finger at Iran, saying very clearly, and this is a direct quote, Iran is taking a step backwards in democracy. Now, for most of the region, when you hear something like that, you recognize that the joke that's inherent in this, that you're standing next to somebody who's been president for 30 years, who has never, ever run against anyone, except for this last time. He did, under pressure from the United States. Finally, Hosni Mubarak ran against someone for the office of president. was a little awkward because the person he was running against was running from a prison cell, but nevertheless, he was still running against someone. And so those kinds of comments really, get to the heart of the way that Iran believes it's being treated by the United States. And so diplomacy and dialogue in and of itself, I think Stephen is right when he says, we're in a situation now for the first time, I think, in American history in which we're treating diplomacy as a reward for good behavior, as opposed to as a means of getting good behavior from our enemies. But nevertheless, I think even in the push for diplomacy and in the push for dialogue, there is on the Iranian side a real sense that, look, dialogue, diplomacy is useless unless you're willing to take us seriously. We're not going to sit across the table from you when for 30 years the very focus of your foreign policy towards us has been regime change. Because we're not going to talk to you about anything if whatever it is that you're thinking of ends with getting rid of us. So that sense, I think, is what's really missing, and why you do get, beyond the obvious political reasons, a much more visceral, much more emotional sense of a bridge that divides these two countries. Now, speaking of that, of course, and talking about the military option that you hear repeatedly, which is repeatedly told to us that is on the table, I hang around, because of the work that I do, unfortunately, with a lot of the punditry class. These are the people who get paid to just yap about what you should be thinking for yourself. And of course, there are all kinds of ideas about what a military attack on Iran would look like, what it would do, whether it's possible, whether it's not possible. And I find it very interesting that very, very rarely are people in the military actually brought in for that discussion. So we are grateful for the opportunity now to hear from General Johns about the nuts and bolts of this issue of the folly of attacking Iran. So General Johns.
First, let me give the notion that I'm not going to speak strictly with the nuts and bolts of the military. My last 35 years have been focused on national security strategy. That encompasses diplomacy, economics, as well as military element. I taught for 15 years at the National Defense University national security strategy and national security decision-making. I want to put this in the context of our overall Pax Americana national security strategy that George Bush announced in September of 2002 to include preventive wars. There is a difference between preemptive wars and preventive wars. The United Nations and international law allows you to preempt someone who's about to attack. It does not allow you to conduct preventive wars that someone might be a threat 10, 15, 20 years from now. So I want to put it in that context. And I don't want to be overly dramatic, but I believe the next administration is going to be faced with a situation that will determine the future of this country. Literally, if we don't handle it correctly, we may provide material for another chapter in Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And if we do not handle the current situation that was evidenced on 9/11, we may see the clash of civilization that Samuel Huntington talked about. Now, as I said, I don't want to be overly dramatic or pessimistic, but let me make my case. 9/11 was an attack that could be just an act of an isolated small group of Islamic radicals that could be easily contained and eliminated. Or it could be the signal or the trigger for that clash of civilizations. There are two things that you need to do to defeat insurgents, whether it be in Vietnam or any other place. The first one is to isolate them from the general population so that they do not have support, that general population gives you intelligence of where they are. And then the second step is to use precise surgical force to eliminate them. I emphasize precise force. And as you're going to see, what we did in Vietnam and Iraq is throw in divisions of tanks and this sort of thing. Okay, let's talk the first one of isolating them from the general population. On 9/12 of 01, the world was with us. 200,000 people marched in Tehran in support of the United States in condemning Al-Qaeda. Le Monde, the most liberal paper on the continent, we are all Americans today. We knew that this was headquarters in Afghanistan. And although I cannot endorse the way we went about it, I can't Monday morning quarterback it and say it was wrong. The United Nations was with us. The Islamic world was with us. I was over in Oman teaching a one-week course six weeks after 9/11. And the commander of the Air Force, of Omani Air Force, had me over there teaching his senior officers. I went to their bases. We had American airplanes there to support going into Afghanistan. United Nations put their approval on it. Russia and Iran cooperated fully. And as Stephen was talking about the Afghanistan rebellion, the freedom fighters against Russia, that ended up us supporting the group that became the Taliban. Iran put us in contact with a Northern Alliance group to use Afghan warriors to overthrow the Taliban instead of massive U.S. troops. And we put special forces, that surgical element of military power, into Afghanistan to go after Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Everything fine. Iran even closed off the border so that Taliban and Al-Qaeda couldn't come across. Those that came through, they put them in prison, offered them up to us for intelligence, full cooperation from Iran. 3 months later, in his State of the Union address, George Bush made Iran one of the charter members of the Axis of Evil. Thank you very much, Iran, for trying to cooperate. And then, within a couple of months, it became clear that George Bush intended to go into Iraq. Now, make no bones about it, his father knew it. His father's closest advisors, Pete McCloskey, 16-year Republican representative in California, and I got on we were talking on the telephone in August of 2002, and he said, "Did you read Brent Scowcroft's article, the op-ed page of the Wall Street Journal?" He's saying, "Don't do this, George Bush," and he is speaking for the father. Pete McCloskey said, "You can put that in your pipe and smoke it," that his father is trying to get him to get out of the grip of Cheney and the neocon Balkans. Because that group had developed a plan for a world hegemony of the United States back in the late 80s, and in 1990 it leaked out of the Pentagon. I was at NDU teaching then, And we got this, and they said, oh, no, 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 that was just a small study. War. It was the basis for the U.S. to exercise world hegemony and prevent any power that might compete with us from gaining the ability to do that. Now, you want to talk about Pax Americana, big, that was their training secretary. In September 2000, when they thought George was going to be in the White House, they resurrected that plan, and that became the basis of the September 2002 National Security Strategy. Read the first paragraph, and it tells you what we were planning to do. So, we didn't stay with the effort in Afghanistan to pull the special forces out. We shifted, and we went into Iraq. Against the advice of every senior military person, other than Tommy Franks, who got the Medal of Freedom, along with George Tenet, who said it's a slam dunk, and Paul Bremer, who just dissolved the whole structure in Iraq and made the mess. Those three got Medals of Freedom. But Brent Scowcroft said this notion of going in and spreading democracy is a pipe dream. Joseph Nye said it's not idealism, it's illusionism. Every senior military, including Tony Zinni, Joe Hoare, Marine four-star generals who had commanded in CENTCOM, and the Chief of Staff of the Army said, don't do this. And if you do it, it's going to take 400,000 or 500,000 American troops to occupy. Tommy Franks said we'll be only about 30,000 left in 3 months. Richard Pearl, right after mission was accomplished, he was head of the Defense Policy Board, came on and said, Syria, you're next. Iran, you're next. We have really shown you what we can do. Now, if you want to talk about homonymous calculations, I don't have time to go into the military fiasco, as Tom Ricks called it in his book, Fiasco. Incidentally, I'm on an internet discussion group that has over 250 people, including General Jack Vesey, a lot of people. Tom Ricks is on it, David Ignatius is on it, Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Dick Halloran, I'm sure you know, a group of people like that, and when they exchange views, and 3 of the 5 brain trusts for General Petraeus is on this internet group. So I get information and perspective from all. What I can say about Iraq in general is that we turned the country apart. I'm not criticizing our military. They were given mission impossible. I have a paper on a website that you can read saying counterinsurgency with U.S. combat forces, mission impossible. The French showed that in Indochina, Algiers. We repeated it in Vietnam. We've repeated it in Iraq. And do you know, candidates from both parties are now saying, if we can beef up the Army and Marines by another 300,000, then in the future we will have the force to make an operation like that successful. Let me tell you, that is going to lead us into other fiascos. Do not support anyone that says we need several 100,000 people to conduct counterinsurgency. But what we've done is split the country into 3 segments. The Kurds, the Sunnis now, and Baghdad, which was 70% Sunni at the beginning of the war, and about 600,000 Christians, most Americans. We've got hundreds of thousands of Christians in Iraq. You had, no more. Those that were not killed are refugees. It is now 60% Shiite. We, through brutal sectarian cleansing, We have created over 4 million refugees. Half of them are in other countries that cannot handle them. We finally decided that we could not defeat the Sunnis and the Al-Qaeda that they had invited in to help us. But remember, Bremer went in and he said, all Sunnis, Ba'athists, in the military, the police, and civil service, you're fired. They ran the country, and he dissolved those 3 institutions. And he told the Sunnis, you've been disenfranchised in this. What did you expect them to do? Say, sorry, master, they turned to insurgency. Well, we changed that policy, and we decided to work with the tribal chiefs in Anbar province, train and arm their militia that are hostile to the central government. We have, for short-term benefit, now created a situation that you're never going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Politically, it reduced violence, and now it's off the radar screen. See how many people really care. And my good friend John McCain, a classmate of mine from the National War College, he's been in my home for dinner. First sign I ever put in my yard was John McCain in 2000. This guy is now, what Pat Buchanan said, he's George Bush on steroids. He is pugnacious, and he's going to be the candidate. I'm a political independent, but what I'm going to say, you'll know where I come out. I have very close friends working with the Clinton campaign, and closer friends, the 2 senior advisors on defense with Barack Obama, are personal friends. One of them was at that dinner with John McCain when he and Cindy were at my home. That's Dick Danzig, former Secretary of the Navy under Clinton, and he will likely be the next Secretary of Defense. But Obama is saying the right things. Yes. He's saying the right things about negotiating, and so I am now closely in contact with the Obama group. But let me say this about Iraq. And I'm going to say the lessons learned and then apply them to Iran and future policy. We needed a bipartisan approach from the beginning. And we needed the international community to support us. We didn't do either. George Bush, and I will just say it, I believe he deliberately lied to Congress and the American people to mislead them about the connections between Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in Iraq and on the weapons of mass destruction. He didn't give them time, the IAEA, to find out if there were weapons of mass destruction, because he was hell-bent on going to war. So he destroyed any kind of consensus. His father, George Bush Sr., working through some people that I know, and I met with them when they were doing this, formed the Baker-Hamilton Group, the Iraqi Study Group, in the spring of 2006, waited to report out until December after the elections to give his hard-headed son, I'll leave off, hard-headed son, a cover for getting out of Iraq. They had 78 recommendations, but these were the 3 major. Disengage U.S. combat forces, conduct vigorous diplomatic effort to get this internationalized to include the major players in the region, including Iran, Syria, Turkey, Egypt, and the others. And third, focus on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is at the nub of most of the problems there. He used a very vulgar term when that was presented to him. And I asked Lee Hamilton one day, I said, did he actually say that? And he said, yes, he said that. He just turned down his best chance to make a bipartisan approach to it. Now, many people will argue you couldn't do this. The same crew that says you shouldn't negotiate said, oh, you would never get the international community. You don't know unless you try. So that's the situation. And if you ask me, how do you get out of Iraq? I don't know. I don't care how long you stay there. If John McCain says he will stay 100 years, that's going to come back to haunt him in the general election. I believe. Because you're not going to see the tranquility in Iraq next November that you see today. This political ploy was just a little too early, in my view. And you're going to see that the surge has not worked politically. So what lessons can we learn to apply to Iran and the future administration? Gary Hart, who is the president of the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation and the Council for a Livable World that I'm associated with, I'm a board member, is drafting for the next administration a national security strategy. And he's got his head screwed on right, because I agree with it. He ran it by me, and he's got it screwed on right. But here's the thing that you have to understand. It has to be a world community effort. You have to work through multinational organizations, including the United Nations. There are probably people in this room who say the United Nations is worthless. My son is one of those. He just, oh, it's a piece of it. And I just, in any case, you got to do that. Secondly, you got to get rid of this militaristic climate in the United States that thinks the primary element of foreign policy and national security is military power. The military power that was used in World War II is no longer effective. It wasn't effective in Korea. You couldn't have the total victory. It certainly is inappropriate for counterinsurgency such as Vietnam and Iraq. That has to be done by indigenous forces. So let's try to get rid of the notion, look, I'm for a strong military. And I'm for the use even of coercive diplomacy to threaten military action. But I know the limitations of it, and it should be the last resort, not the first resort. So those two things. The next thing you have to understand is that we no longer are going to be able to dominate the world. Economically, I can go into that, but you know, you see the situation now. China's got $900 billion of our securities, etc. They've got us by the short hair. We can no longer dominate the IMF, the World Bank, to use draconian population to remove all social nets and this sort of thing. We can't do that. So let's go to Iran, and let me address, just briefly, the military situation. It is not that we could not bomb with missiles and up to 600 targets. Now, some of this is classified, but I got it from the friends. I can just assure you that it is real. That we have plans to destroy 12 to 1,600 military targets in Iran. We might be able to do that, but you're going to have state forces in the likelihood, and you're going to have asymmetrical warfare of supporting people in Afghanistan and the Middle East, and the spreading of destruction and terrorism in Kuwait, UAE, and the other areas. $100 a barrel, he's not exaggerating. Chaos in the world. The person who is in possession of that thought would do that. The last thing I believe is the condition of our U.S. military. My grandfather was in basic training in He flew up to the age of 42 This last few months, I believe last year, fewer than 70% had high school diplomas. We're waiving felonies. We're waiving drug abuse. Ladies and gentlemen, our military is at the point of being broken. The Chief of Staff of the Army is arguing this. We don't have the means to do this. You hear about the surge and the drawdown. 2 weeks ago, George Bush went to the Middle East, met with Petraeus, and publicly said, "Now, General Petraeus, I listened to my military advisors. If you say we need to keep these troops here, I will keep them." And American people, you understand I'm asking my military advisors. What about General Petraeus' immediate boss, Admiral Fallon, the commander of Central Command, his immediate boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, and his boss, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates? I invite you to say, if he listens to them, why does he pick one that will say what he wants to hear? It's a charade. I will close by telling you that you would be surprised if you knew the number of senior military officers, retired and on active duty, who agree completely with what I'm saying here this afternoon. They are fed up, and some of you may have read, I know this from a friend of mine involved in it, the senior people asked us, can senior military people find out on earth from the president? They're referring to Stephen heard that at the Army War College, didn't you? They're discussing that in the senior colleges. That's how far it's come with the policies of this president. Once again, I hate to be pessimistic, but I don't know who, I wouldn't want to be president, but it may be the president. And the American people wake up and not let him do again in Iran what he did in Iraq. Thank you much.